Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and this is my review of episode 10 of season 4 of Star Trek Discovery. And I have less complaints than usual about this episode. I did enjoy it visually, it had some neat looking special effects, a lot of callbacks to the original series, even though it also has continuity issues, which I'm going to discuss. And there's even some internal continuity problems in the show itself, because in season 1 they specifically said that the mycelium network spreads out into infinity and that they can go anywhere in the universe and stuff like that, and suddenly they retcon their own show by saying it's limited only to our own galaxy, and so it stops at the edge of the galaxy. That's why they cannot spore jump beyond the edge of the galaxy, and they have to physically go through the barrier. And it's a continuity issue with TNG, because in TNG they didn't seem to have any problems going beyond the galaxy, even though it was with the help of the Traveler, so you can excuse it that way, that they didn't go through the normal way, they phased through it thanks to the Traveler. But in the same episode they also said they have no problem transmitting something back to Starfleet. And yet in this episode of Discovery they said that communication also doesn't get through the barrier. And visually it actually looked more like that barrier in the center of the galaxy, which we saw in Star Trek V. And of course that movie by itself is its own continuity nightmare, especially because that was a different barrier at the center of the galaxy, and yet it was similar to what was shown in this episode of Discovery. And there's a scene when the Admiral specifically says that they never went through the barrier, so is he unaware of all those instances back in TOS and TNG when they did cross the barrier, and not always with the help of some alien, a few times they did it all by themselves apparently. So it's a big continuity mess, but I do think it can be explained away with some creative thinking, so maybe I'll do it later. And I do like the fact that they finally put some limitations on the Spore drive, because it was overpowered. That was one of my problems with it from the beginning, that basically they can get anywhere instantly, so what's the point of even having starships anymore? So they're basically the Iconians now, so putting some kind of limitation on it is a good thing, because in any future Star Trek show, which I always said I want to see Starfleet go out and explore other galaxies, so it would be a nice excuse to say that the mycelium network only works in the Milky Way galaxy, and maybe the whole galaxy united in a galactic federation and all of that, but now they'll be exploring other galaxies which don't have that network, and so it will be a more old-fashioned way of exploring the universe on a starship, and so in some ways this is a good thing. And it's also funny how visually the inside of the barrier kind of reminded me of that episode of the Orville when they were going through some kind of space anomaly which looked like bubbles, and even in Star Trek Prodigy in the opening we also see something similar, and now in this episode the Discovery can only get through the barrier if they go into these strange bubbles that are floating around there, and visually it reminds me of the Orville. And I saw some people complaining in previous episodes how the new shuttles in Discovery are really similar to the ones in the Orville, and in the previous episode we saw one of them dock with Book's ship, and it had that little sleeve thing from the back connecting to the other ship, so it was just like in the Orville. Now we have even more visual similarities, and so it becomes less likely to be a coincidence, especially since this show is always borrowing visual ideas from other movies and shows, and so it's not illogical to assume they took some inspiration from the Orville as well. And it's funny how some of the dialogue is similar to the dialogue in the TOS episode where No Man Has Gone Before, which was the first time we saw the Galactic Barrier. And yet it seems as if they misunderstood some of the dialogue when they referenced it. Because I think Spock said that their sensors cannot detect the barrier and said energy negative, so it sounded as if he was saying that there is no energy being detected, and yet in this episode of Discovery they said that it's made out of negative energy. So this is either a misunderstanding of the original dialogue or kind of a clever retcon of that old dialogue, making it sound more clever than it was. And so I kind of like it and dislike it at the same time, because they almost did an excellent job of retconning things and tying things together in new and interesting ways, and yet at the same time they didn't do it perfectly. They didn't pay enough attention to all the details from all the shows to make all of it make sense. And the technobabble is kind of silly sounding, like they say they now have to use programmable antimatter to repel the negative energy, of the barrier to be able to get through it, and so it all sounds really silly because, antimatter is still affected by gravity just as normal matter. It's not creating anti-gravity. It doesn't work like that, and yet the writers don't seem to know it. And by the way, I'm working on a whole compilation of all the scientific mistakes they made in the technobabble of the show, and it's really worse, much worse than in all the previous shows. And Star Trek often had a lot of mistakes. I'm not saying the old shows didn't do silly unscientific technobabble, but in this show it seems to be worse than before, and there was once again a mention of space being loud, and once they go out of the galaxy suddenly it's quiet, and I don't like how they seem to confuse radiation with sound in the show. They don't seem to be able to tell the difference. They think that sonar is radar, and so they confuse everything, and that really annoys me sometimes. And so they think that antimatter repels negative energy. And meanwhile, Book and Tarka go to the place where Tarka used to be imprisoned with that guy he fell in love with who wants to go to some other universe, and we get to see some of that backstory. And I'm kind of hoping that maybe in the end of the season Tarka will be able to go to that other universe, and then they can show us that that universe looks like the real Star Trek universe in the style of TNG or TOS, in which everything is bright and beautiful and it's an utopia with the prosperous federation and all of that. That would be so funny to me if they actually show something like that, even a hint of that, because that can explain that this entire show, Star Trek Discovery, is actually set in a completely different universe, which is more dark than the real Star Trek universe in the older shows. That would be funny, so that's what I would have done, since they have this whole setup already. And it's funny how this alien struggled so much to build a transporter to another universe, and yet in Deep Space Nine we saw that it's not so hard to beam to other universes. It even happened by accident in TOS when they accidentally beamed into the mirror universe, and also in season 1 they used the Spore network to jump to other universe. And it's funny that Tarka was working on the prototype of a new generation of Spore drive, and so how come he didn't try to use that to create the portal to another universe, since he must know that Discovery jumped to the mirror universe using the Spore network? So how come he never tried to use that to get there? And so it's once again kind of internal inconsistencies, internal continuity problems, because that alien said that it's enough to use just one warp core to make it possible, so he didn't need the energy of the DMA that Tarka seems to think he needs to do it. And so how come that alien thought it's enough to use a normal warp core to achieve it, and yet Tarka thinks he has to harness the powers of the DMA to make it possible? So it seems like an internal continuity issue and a continuity issue with the other Star Trek shows, and even in season 1 of this show, in which they easily jump to other universes using the Spore network. And I like the fact they left it ambiguous if that alien actually managed to beam himself to that other universe or not. They kind of left clues that he did, and yet it didn't seem logical because those guards caught him doing it and they beat him up, so why would they ever let him try to do it again, since they know that he was trying to do it? And so it doesn't really make any sense. I guess we'll find out in the last episode of the season. And I also like that they didn't directly show that Tarka was in love with that guy in a romantic sense. They just showed that they were friends, they got really close together, but they didn't directly show that they were lovers, even though in one scene they were in the same bed together, so it was kind of implied. And the way they made his makeup to look kind of cute in a kind of feminine way, like they gave him those big cheeks and the cute looking face, so even though he's an exotic alien, they try to make him kind of appealing, I guess. And so there was definitely some hints that it was romantic, especially the dialogue in previous episodes when he was talking about his friend that he so desperately wants to reunite with. So it does sound like love and not just friendship, but it wasn't specifically shown in these flashbacks, which is a good thing, especially since it's an exotic alien, so that will be just kind of weird. We have so many of that kind of stuff in the show already, and we have that subplot of Saru being in love with the Vulcan president, which also comes with them on the mission for some reason, because they said the Vulcan delegates didn't have enough time to get to the Discovery before it goes there, even though it makes no sense because Discovery could simply spore jump to the location of those delegates and pick them up in an instant, so that excuse didn't really make any sense. And so we have the subplot of Saru being in love with the president, and we have so many of these other lovers of the same sex on the ship already, so that will just be kind of an overkill of that diversity quota and all of that. And there was even a line when the Federation president said she has a partner and not a husband, even though I think she said it's a he and not a she. Maybe marriage doesn't exist anymore at all, I guess. And there's a Adira coming to the ship, and once again they have a whole scene calling Adira they, them, and it's just so confusing dialogue. Like Stammen starts saying, they fix that, they fix this, and it's not clear who he's talking about. And so this is the problem with that kind of dialogue, that it's unnecessarily confusing. I personally think language should be as simple as possible to convey the most amount of information in the quickest and easiest and less confusing way, and so that's why I don't like that whole pronoun thing. I made a whole video just on that and saying that especially in the universe of Star Trek it makes no sense. Wouldn't they simply invent new words to describe such things when they have aliens with multiple genders and stuff like that? How come they have language problems? Wouldn't they simply invent new words to fit those situations? And so that's why it's kind of annoying, and it seems so forced and artificial in the show, because that seems to be Adira's only purpose on the show, just to push those ideas of, oh, you have to respect the pronouns and all of that, because the character itself is not developed anymore. Like, I actually liked that episode when she first showed up. I said it's my favorite episode of the whole show, but they didn't do anything with the character later on, except these agendas of pushing the pronouns, and so that's the only purpose of that character on the show, and that's annoying. And also the Federation president comes with them on the mission, and then we have the scene of Michael bossing around the Federation president. She's actually lecturing the president, telling her what to do, what to tell the crew or not tell the crew, how to act on her ship, that she's the boss and not the president, that she gives the orders and not the president. And that was so funny because I predicted this from early on in the season when they first showed that the president is kind of opposing Michael, and I actually really liked the president at first because everything she was saying was actually correct. All her criticism toward Michael was actually correct. I actually was enjoying her dialogue because it was correct and clever. And yet I predicted even back then that by the end of the season she will be bowing down to Michael and apologizing to her, and Michael will be the boss and she will be more superior than the president. And that's exactly what happens now when she is bossing around the Federation president, who agrees with her and bows down to her by the end. And so that was kind of, again, unintentional comedy in my opinion, the way that Michael has to be the alpha female. She has to be the most superior one. She's the cleverest one. And by the end of the episode, she says she accepts the Federation president as her president. And then the president seems to be so relieved and happy that Michael accepted her. She literally almost bows down to her. That is so ridiculous and so funny, especially because it was so predictable. So just ridiculous. And they also had an argument about whether or not to tell the crew that they got a transmission from the Admiral who told them that the DMA anomaly is now heading to Earth and Vulcan to destroy them. Of course. And the president said that they should keep it a secret from the crew as not to distract them. And Michael says, no, we have to tell the crew because they consider Earth their home and all of that. And that was also so ridiculous because, first of all, the very idea that the anomaly is now heading to Earth, that made me laugh out loud because it was also so predictable. I immediately said, of course it is. Of course they have to raise the stakes. Of course Earth itself has to be in danger now. And that's so formulatic, that's so predictable, it's so silly. From the millions of planets in the galaxy, of course it has to go to Earth immediately. The only way I would be able to accept it is if they say it's deliberate, that maybe the aliens who made the DMA recognized Discovery in the area before it was destroyed and knew it's from Earth, and that's why they're now moving to Earth to destroy it, to punish them. Then that will be at least more logical. And then they have that argument about whether or not to tell the crew, and the president said, no, keep it a secret, it's not relevant to the mission is the same. And Michael says, no, they have to know, we have to be honest with them. And that was also cringy. I have so many examples in my mind about times when Captain Picard or Kirk kept some details about the mission hidden from the crew because it was necessary for the mission. And in this case, why have that unnecessary distraction? What difference does it make if they know or not that Earth is being threatened? Will it not just make it more risky? What if some members of the crew decide to do something reckless? I mean, just an episode ago, they had to deal with Book and Tarka, who did reckless things and didn't obey orders, and we saw some members of the Discovery crew siding with them. So why risk having more crew members doing stupid stuff like that when it happened just recently? So why tell them? So I actually, once again, agree with the president and not with Michael, and yet Michael asserts her dominance and forces the president to tell everyone on the ship because she wants it, because she believes in honesty and all of that. And meanwhile, in the Tarka flashbacks, we also see how easy it is to remove those implants they had at the back of their necks that we saw in the previous season when Michael was trying to rescue Book from that work camp. And he said it's impossible to rescue him because of that implant, because his head will blow up if he leaves that place. So I presume that the implant is connected to the brain in some way that is not easily removable, that if someone tries to remove it, it will explode and his brain will be damaged or something. So it shouldn't be easy to do it, and yet in the flashbacks they show us in this episode, it's actually super easy. It's barely an inconvenience. You just have to phaser yourself in the back of the neck and then you can easily peel it off, and it's no big deal at all. It's barely even painful. So that also made me laugh so hard, because it just seems like an internal inconsistency and just an illogical thing to do. Like, what's the point of that implant if it's so easy to remove it? And this is again the 32nd century and they couldn't find a better restraint for prisoners, that they cannot remove it so easily. And another thing that annoyed me is that once again we saw a cloaked ship, which you can easily spot and see and hear, and they can even know what ship it is. Like, Book scans it and know exactly the type of ship it is, even though it's supposedly cloaked and it's just the Predator ripple effect. And this is all taking place in the 32nd century, when even back in the 23rd century of this show, the Klingons had much better cloaking devices, which did not just look like ripples in space, but were completely invisible. And yet 1,000 years later, the cloaking technology seems to de-evolve and is now just barely cloaks anything. Like, you can spot the shape of the ship from a distance. So that again seems really silly. The only example that is similar to this in the old Trek shows was in the movie Insurrection, when they uncovered that cloaked ship which was hidden in the lake. It also looked like that, but I always thought it looked like that because it was covered with water, because Deta drained that lake, so you can actually see the water which is still on it, and that's why it was visible. If not for the water, it would be completely invisible, as all cloaking devices used to be back then in the old shows. And yet now in this show, in this season, suddenly all cloaked ships are easily visible. You can really see the shape of the ship, you can scan it and know what ship it is. So what's even the point of the cloaking device if it's so useless? And so things like that is really making me facepalm when I watch the show. Like, why is it so silly? And the biggest problem with the whole season, in my opinion, is just how slow it progresses. Like, the overall plot of the season could have been good, but it's so thinly stretched out, so it better be worth it in the end. They made us wait for so many episodes, so the reveal should be something amazing and epic, otherwise it will just be such a lame season. And the only way it won't be is if they do something really amazing in the last episode that will connect everything in such an epic, interesting way and it will be so fun, then maybe I will forgive it. But if it's lame in the end, which probably it will be, then I will say this is the worst season of the entire show. And it's really moving at a snail pace. It's so slow, it's so boring, it barely has any substance to it, except a few interesting scenes here and there, a few interesting special effects here and there. So it's not all bad, it's not all terrible, but it's pretty lame so far overall. So that's my opinion. Let me know what you think and we can discuss all of this in the comments below, and I will see you all next time. Bye bye.